Picture this. You're standing in the shadowy corridors of ancient Memphis, capital of the pharaohs, and you witness something that makes your blood run cold. The young king himself, barely out of childhood, is being carried on a golden litter because his legs can no longer support his divine body. His jaw hangs open in a way that makes speech difficult. His skull stretches backward like melted wax, and his chest bears the soft curves of a woman despite his royal masculinity. But the most horrifying truth whispered by palace servants is this. His parents were brother and sister. His grandparents were brother and sister. His great-grandparents were brother and sister. Every breath he takes is a struggle against genetic poison flowing through veins that were supposed to carry the blood of gods. Before diving into these forgotten stories of divine destruction, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient tragedies together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about humanity's darkest chapters. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of royal excess. It's the story of how absolute power, combined with religious fanaticism, created the longest-running genetic experiment in human history. An experiment that turned palaces into laboratories of suffering and transformed living gods into victims of their own beliefs. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt didn't set out to destroy themselves. They thought they were preserving something sacred, something divine that was too precious to contaminate with common blood. Let's start with the logic that seemed flawless to every priest and advisor in the ancient world. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were living gods, earthly embodiments of Horus, divine descendants of Ra himself. How could a god marry a mortal? How could divine blood be diluted with human weakness? The answer to every religious authority was obvious. Gods must marry gods. Brothers must marry sisters. The bloodline must remain pure. Picture the first pharaoh who decided his sister was the only woman worthy of his bed. He looked at his subjects, farmers and craftsmen, and ordinary people, and felt genuine revulsion at the thought of his divine essence mixing with their common blood. His priests nodded approvingly. His advisors calculated the political advantages. No one considered the price his children would pay. What began as religious conviction became cultural obsession. Egyptian royal siblings grew up believing that marrying each other was not just normal but necessary. They were taught that their bloodline carried the essence of Ra himself, that diluting it with foreign blood would anger the gods and doom the kingdom. Generation after generation, they condemned their own children to suffer for beliefs they never questioned. Each marriage between siblings was like adding poison to a well. The first generation might show only minor problems, a slight jaw irregularity perhaps, or unusual facial features. The priests would interpret these as marks of divine favor, proof that the gods had blessed this union. But genetic damage accumulated like sediment in the Nile, building layer upon layer until the very foundation of the bloodline became toxic. What started as divine preservation became systematic destruction, but it happened so slowly that no one could see the pattern. A royal child born with a clubfoot, a blessing from the gods, a prince who died at 20, called home to serve in the afterlife, a princess who couldn't bear living children, chosen for higher spiritual purposes. Every genetic disaster was reinterpreted as divine will. Every symptom of inbreeding transformed into evidence of godly favor. The Egyptians were brilliant. They built pyramids that still stand today, developed mathematics that amazes modern scholars, created one of the world's first written languages. But they couldn't see what was happening to their royal families because they refused to look. Court physicians documented strange illnesses and early deaths, but never connected them to the obvious cause. They had all the evidence they needed spread across centuries of royal tombs, but their religious beliefs made them blind to the truth staring them in the face. The genetic time bomb was ticking in every palace nursery, in every royal marriage bed, in every prayer offered for the continuation of the divine bloodline. What they thought would preserve their godhood would ultimately prove their humanity in the most tragic way possible. And nowhere was this tragedy more visible than in the royal family that would shock Egypt to its core. In the sweltering heat of 1353 BCE, in a palace overlooking the Nile, a child is born who will grow up to become one of history's most controversial pharaohs. But before Akhenaten becomes the heretic king who abandons Egypt's gods, he is simply a boy trapped in a body that betrays his divine claims. His skull is elongated, stretched like taffy. His hips are wide like a woman's. His chest develops breasts that no amount of royal clothing can hide. The young prince grows up surrounded by servants who avert their eyes and courtiers who speak in carefully measured phrases. Everyone can see that something is wrong with the future pharaoh, but no one dares speak the truth. His reflection in polished bronze shows him a face that doesn't match the god kings in temple paintings. His walk is awkward, his voice strange. Other children watch him with a mixture of fear and pity. The palace becomes a theatre of whispered conversations and averted gazes. Servants learn to look past his unusual proportions. Priests craft elaborate explanations for why their future god king looks so different from the divine statues lining the temples. His parents, themselves products of generations of sibling marriage, see their son's deformities and convince themselves these are marks of special divine favor. After all, the gods work in mysterious ways. When the prince finally becomes pharaoh, he does something unprecedented. He orders artists to portray the royal family realistically. For the first time in Egyptian history, royal art shows elongated skulls, protruding bellies, and strange proportions. Historians call it an artistic revolution. But the truth is simpler and more tragic. The young king is tired of living a lie. If his body is a temple to the gods, then the gods must look exactly like he does. The paintings and sculptures from his reign are haunting. They show a family that looks almost alien. Elongated heads, feminine curves on male bodies, children with the same disturbing proportions as their parents. Modern viewers often assume these are stylistic choices, artistic interpretations. They're not. They're documentation of genetic damage so severe that even royal propaganda couldn't hide it anymore. The heretic pharaoh marries Nefertiti, and together they produce 6 daughters. Court records hint at sons who die in infancy, their small bodies unable to survive the genetic burden passed down through generations. The daughters who live show the same elongated features, the same strange proportions. Palace artists paint them as divine beauties, but servants whisper about the princesses who hide from sunlight and struggle with simple tasks. Perhaps this king's religious revolution, his abandonment of Egypt's traditional gods for worship of a single deity, is born from genetic desperation. If the old gods have cursed his bloodline, maybe a new god will show mercy. He moves the capital from Thebes to a new city, Amarna, abandoning centuries of tradition. He declares himself the sole interpreter of divine will, the only channel between the god Aten and humanity. But even a new god cannot fix genes that have been poisoned for generations. The move to Amarna becomes an exercise in royal isolation. The new capital is built in the desert, far from the traditional power centers of Egypt. The royal family lives in splendid genetic isolation, producing art that documents their deformities while pretending they represent divine perfection. The revolutionary pharaoh dies young, as do most men in his family line. His religious revolution dies with him, abandoned by successors desperate to return to traditional ways. The new capital is deserted, its buildings crumbling under the desert sun. His name is chiseled from monuments, his memory condemned by the very priests whose gods he had abandoned. But the genetic damage continues, passed like a curse to the next generation, to a boy who will become even more famous for his tragic inheritance. The son of this heretic king will inherit not just a throne, but DNA so damaged that his every breath will be a struggle against the accumulated genetic mistakes of his ancestors. The boy enters the world in 1341 BCE, already carrying his father's curse. His name is Tutankhamun, and he will become Egypt's most tragic king. Imagine being 9 years old and struggling to walk, while palace servants pretend not to notice your stumbling. The boy king's left foot turns inward, what modern medicine calls clubfoot, making every step an ordeal. His spine curves abnormally, forcing him into painful positions that make sitting on the golden throne an exercise in concealed agony. His chest is malformed, making breathing difficult in Egypt's desert heat. Palace physicians hover around him constantly, but their prayers and potions cannot fix what genetics has broken. The cruel irony of the teenage pharaoh's life is that he is worshipped as a living god, while his body fails him daily. Subjects prostrate themselves before a teenager who needs walking sticks to cross a room. Religious ceremonies designed to showcase divine power become exercises in carefully concealed weakness. Priests chant about the pharaoh's divine strength, while servants discreetly position supports to keep their god-king upright. Court records discovered thousands of years later paint a heartbreaking picture of royal medical intervention. Over 130 walking sticks are eventually placed in the young ruler's tomb, not symbols of divine authority, but desperate aids for a body that can barely support itself. Some are simple canes, others are elaborate golden staffs, but all serve the same purpose, helping a crippled god-king maintain the illusion of divine perfection. The divine child grows up in golden isolation, surrounded by luxury, but starved of genuine human connection. Other children are kept away, partly for his protection, partly to hide his condition from prying eyes. His wife, Akhenaten, is also his half-sister, carrying the same genetic burden that makes their marriage not just incestuous, but practically guaranteed to produce damaged offspring. Their attempts to have children result in miscarriages and stillbirths. Tiny mummies found buried with them serve as silent witnesses to genetic incompatibility. The psychological torture of Egypt's tragic prince cannot be overstated. He grows up surrounded by temple walls covered with images of strong, perfect pharaohs, his ancestors supposedly, though he must wonder why he looks nothing like them. Court artists tasked with creating his official portraits face an impossible challenge. How do you make a genetic catastrophe look divine? They solve it by avoiding realism entirely, creating stylized images that bear little resemblance to the broken boy on the throne. Palace physicians document the broken pharaoh's condition with meticulous care, creating what modern scientists recognize as the world's first detailed study of inbreeding effects. They catalog his bone deformities, his immune deficiencies, his hormonal abnormalities. They note his frequent illnesses, his difficulty healing from minor wounds, his struggle to gain weight despite royal abundance. What they cannot understand is that they're documenting the inevitable result of centuries of genetic isolation. At 19, the young king's immune system finally surrenders. A simple case of malaria, the kind that healthy people survive, becomes fatal for a body weakened by genetic damage. As he lies dying in his golden palace, burning with fever that his compromised immune system cannot fight, perhaps he understands what his physicians cannot, that his suffering was not divine will, but the inevitable result of choices made by ancestors who valued political purity over human health. The boy pharaoh dies young and is buried quickly, forgotten by history until Howard Carter discovers his tomb in 1922. The very genetic damage that made his life a misery also makes him famous. His early death preserves his tomb intact for modern archaeologists. In 2010, DNA analysis finally reveals the truth his court physicians documented but could never understand. He was the product of sibling incest, a victim of royal policies that treated human beings as breeding stock for political convenience. You might think that Tutankhamun's death would have taught Egypt a lesson about the price of genetic isolation. You might hope that witnessing such obvious genetic catastrophe would make future rulers question the wisdom of sibling marriage. But power has a way of making people forget inconvenient truths, and the allure of pure bloodlines proved stronger than the evidence of their dangers. The story doesn't end with Tutankhamun's death. Instead, it continues across centuries, across dynasties, across the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Because 1200 years later, in the dying light of Egyptian independence, foreign conquerors would look at the same temple walls that had inspired Akhenaten's family, read the same religious texts that justified royal inbreeding, and decide to repeat the experiment that had already destroyed so many lives. This is exactly what happened when Alexander the Great's empire shattered and his general Ptolemy claimed Egypt as his prize. 1200 years after Tutankhamun's tragic death, Egypt falls to Alexander the Great. When Alexander dies in 323 BCE, his general seizes the throne and makes a catastrophic decision. Surrounded by Egyptian temples depicting divine pharaohs married to their sisters, the Macedonian conqueror decides this must be the secret to maintaining power. He doesn't understand that he's about to repeat Egypt's greatest genetic mistake. The foreign rulers aren't Egyptian, they're Macedonian Greeks who view themselves as superior to the people they rule. But they're also practical politicians who understand that Egyptian subjects expect their pharaohs to follow divine tradition. So the dynasty's founder establishes a system where brothers must marry sisters, generation after generation, creating what will become the most concentrated experiment in royal inbreeding in human history. Picture the palace conversations that must have taken place as each generation of royal children grew up knowing their fate. Brothers and sisters raised together, playing together as children, then forced into marriage beds as teenagers. The psychological horror of this system cannot be overstated. These weren't distant arranged marriages with foreign royalty, but intimate family relationships twisted into reproductive obligations. For 300 years, the Macedonian rulers perfect the art of genetic isolation. The family tree becomes a ladder with the same names repeating endlessly. The founder marries his sister. Their son marries his sister. Their children repeat the cycle without variation. By the time the dynasty ends, the royal bloodline has become so concentrated that family members are simultaneously cousins, siblings, parents, and children to each other in an impossible tangle of genetic relationships. The genetic catastrophe that had consumed Egypt's royal bloodlines for millennia was now complete. The foreign dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries had finally succumbed to the same curse that had claimed their Egyptian predecessors. But the tragedy wasn't just that they repeated the same mistakes. It was that they perfected them. As the last pharaoh's body was sealed in Alexandria's royal tomb, her death marked the end of more than just a dynasty. It marked the conclusion of humanity's longest and most devastating experiment in genetic isolation. 3,000 years of royal inbreeding had finally reached its logical endpoint: complete genetic collapse. The irony is almost too perfect to believe. The Macedonian conquerors, who had swept across Egypt with such military brilliance, who had built libraries and lighthouses that amazed the ancient world, who had commanded fleets that dominated the Mediterranean, had been utterly defeated by the very traditions they had adopted to legitimize their rule. They came as foreign invaders, but died as victims of Egyptian religious beliefs about bloodline purity. The archaeological evidence tells a story more devastating than any historical chronicle. Modern DNA analysis of royal mummies reveals inbreeding coefficients that approach the theoretical maximum possible in human reproduction. These weren't just cousin marriages or even sibling unions. By the final generations, royal family members were related to each other in so many different ways that untangling their genetic relationships requires computer modeling. Picture the royal nurseries of those final decades. Palace physicians had become experts in managing genetic disasters. They knew which types of births to expect, which deformities could be hidden with careful positioning and clothing, which children might survive to adulthood. They had developed an entire medical specialty around treating the consequences of systematic inbreeding. The royal children themselves grew up in a world where genetic abnormalities were so common they seemed normal. A prince with a severely protruding jaw wasn't unusual. A princess who couldn't walk without assistance was simply another member of the family. Siblings who died in infancy were mourned, but not surprising. The palace had become a medical ward, disguised as a center of power. What makes this tragedy even more haunting is that scattered throughout Egyptian history, we find evidence that some rulers understood the problem. Medical papyri contain oblique references to the importance of bringing foreign blood into the royal line. Diplomatic correspondence hints at marriages specifically arranged to introduce genetic diversity. Some pharaohs actively sought wives from distant kingdoms, not just for political alliances, but for the health of their future children. But these moments of insight were always temporary. Political pressures, religious orthodoxy, and the intoxicating appeal of bloodline purity always reasserted themselves. Each dynasty that began with diverse marriages gradually returned to sibling unions as they became more established and more convinced of their divine superiority. The priests played a crucial role in perpetuating this genetic nightmare. They were the ones who interpreted genetic deformities as divine favor, who crafted religious justifications for sibling marriage, who convinced each new generation that their bloodline was too sacred to contaminate. They turned biological catastrophe into theological triumph, creating an entire religious framework that made genetic suicide seem like spiritual necessity. Consider the psychological impact on the royal women who bore these children. They lived in constant fear that their next pregnancy might produce a child so deformed that even royal propaganda couldn't hide the truth. They watched their babies die with disturbing regularity, knowing that their own genetic heritage was partly responsible. Yet they were required to maintain the fiction that their bloodline was blessed by the gods. The economic cost of royal inbreeding was staggering. Maintaining the elaborate medical care required by genetically damaged rulers drained the treasury. The constant succession crises caused by early royal deaths destabilized the government. The psychological toll on the royal family affected their ability to rule effectively. Egypt's decline as a great power cannot be separated from the genetic decline of its ruling class. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this story is how preventable it all was. The Egyptians had access to the entire Mediterranean world. They could have married into any royal family from Nubia to Mesopotamia. They had the wealth and diplomatic connections to arrange marriages that would have brought fresh genetic material into their bloodline. Instead, they chose isolation, convinced that their divine blood was too precious to share. The final queen's suicide wasn't just the end of her personal story. It was the end of a genetic experiment that had consumed countless lives across 3 millennia. Her death by snakebite, if the ancient sources are accurate, becomes almost poetic. The serpent that killed her was the same symbol that had adorned pharaohs' crowns for thousands of years. The divine cobra that was supposed to protect royal power had become the instrument of its final destruction. When Roman soldiers found her body in the royal mausoleum, they were looking at the last representative of a bloodline that had once ruled the greatest empire on earth. But they were also looking at the final victim of humanity's longest genetic disaster. Her death marked not just the end of Egyptian independence, but the end of the royal inbreeding experiment that had defined Egyptian kingship for 3,000 years. The Romans who conquered Egypt learned from its mistakes. They practiced strategic marriages across their vast empire, bringing together bloodlines from Britain to Babylon. They understood that genetic diversity was strength, not contamination. The very practice that had destroyed Egypt's pharaohs became one of the foundations of Roman imperial success. Today, as we study the mummies of these ancient rulers, we see the physical evidence of their genetic tragedy preserved in gold and linen. Their elongated skulls, their malformed jaws, their damaged bones tell a story more powerful than any written history. They wanted to be remembered as gods, but they became humanity's greatest teachers about the importance of genetic diversity. Their sacrifice gave us knowledge. Their suffering became our wisdom. Their genetic curse became our genetic blessing, because we learned from their mistakes. The pharaohs who obsessed over bloodline purity became the strongest argument for genetic diversity in human history. Their mummies, studied by modern scientists, have taught us more about genetics than any textbook could. As we close this chapter of human history, we carry with us the voices of those ancient rulers whispering across the millennia. Choose humanity over ideology, they tell us. Choose health over tradition. Choose love over power. Remember us not as divine kings and queens, but as human beings who deserved better than the fate that genetics and culture conspired to give them. Their golden tombs still gleam in the desert sun, eternal monuments to a tragic experiment that should never be repeated. But their greatest monument isn't made of stone or gold. It's the knowledge we've gained from their suffering, the wisdom we've inherited from their mistakes, and the promise we make to honor their memory by never again sacrificing human health on the altar of political purity. The pharaohs are gone, but their lesson lives on. Genetic diversity isn't contamination, it's salvation.